Good evening, everyone. Is this working well? Can you all hear? Great. Now, I've got a light blinding me, and no one knows how to turn it off or down. And it's right here, but I think it's good for us to sit in the center rather than move sideways, so we're going to put up with it. So welcome, everyone. It's a real honor to have Christina here with us. And I am going to read her biography, or a little bit of it to you, because although all of you know her, some of you may not know some of the more specific details. But before I start, I just want to say I'm Henrietta Bowden-Jones, Vice President of the Royal Society of Medicine, delighted to have both the President and the immediate past President, Roger and Simon, here tonight. It's really special to have you here. Now, these meetings, as you know, used to be, some of them still are online, and they would be 1,000, 2,000, some of them were far more than that. And it would be very interactive, and people would put in their questions, and we, the interviewers, would ask. So I'm going to try and replicate that a little bit by not leaving questions to the end, because we're going to cover a lot of topics. And I know plenty of you in the audience have had experiences, have read, have talked to me about things they're interested in asking. So, you know, every few questions, I'm just going to say, put your hand up if you want to ask something, and we'll do it this way. And it tends to work well. Now, just to let you know, we are going to have another in-person event in a couple of weeks on the 30th, and this will be Simon interviewing Sir Antony Beevor. And so if you enjoy tonight and you want to come back, please do. The other thing I want to say is there are going to be drinks after for half an hour and book signing. So Christina has brought, I think I can see why you brought your son with you in order to carry this enormous suitcase. There are some wonderful
he
books.
Didn't carry
he didn't. He left it to you. Okay. Either way, we will be doing the book signing outside the ENT room, where some people will then stay for dinner. Lastly, let me say we really rely on your feedback forms in order to suggest new speakers, but also to talk about your feelings about the event. And we really scrutinize them and take them seriously. Sometimes there are, 50 people reply. Sometimes like only 2 people fill them in and going, oh, the event was okay. And I think it's because we forget to ask you, so I'm being really clear. Please do say what you think. And now, without further ado, let me just read a little bit about Christina Lamb to you. So she is Chief Foreign Correspondent at the Sunday Times and one of Britain's leading foreign journalists. I can't really speak out more, but I can get the mic to... Yeah, is that better? Okay, good. And one of Britain's leading foreign journalists, as well as a best-selling author. She has reported from most of the world's hotspots, starting with Afghanistan after an unexpected wedding invitation led her to Karachi in 1987 when she was just 21. Her dispatches with the mujaheddin fighting the Soviet Union saw her named Young Journalist of the Year within 2 years. She has since been awarded Foreign Correspondent of the Year 5 times, as well as Europe's top war reporting prize, the Prix Bayeux, and recently given prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award by the Society of Editors. And on it goes. And we will cover a lot of these things and issues and extra bits from the bio. So I'm going to start with a very fundamental question. You've been covering war and conflict for over 30 years. In your opinion, are human beings fundamentally good? Psychiatrist's question, isn't it?
Human beings or politicians? Well, first of all, thanks everyone for coming in. It's a horrible evening, so I appreciate you coming out. And interesting question. I mean, I spend most of my time in bad places talking to bad people, but and people often say to me, how do you manage to do that and not get really depressed? And the fact is that actually in all these bad places, you meet really amazing people doing really good things. I always say in the darkest places, you find the brightest stars. And I've been lucky to meet and work with lots of people who are doing incredible things in really difficult places, not least Malala, but all sorts of people. And so actually my job, despite the fact I go mostly to wars and bad things, has given me a lot of faith actually in human nature, and I've seen how resilient we are. But if you ask me about politicians, I'll say mostly bad, because they're the ones that cause all the problems.
So just digging a little bit deeper there, so would you say that a lot of the unpleasant things you have witnessed have been done by people who had themselves lived through something that led to that violence? Is the violence the kind of violence that you write about in your most recent book on, say, sexual violence to women in war, which we will cover, would you say that that is something that has been conducted systematically as part of war, for example, or is anyone capable of it? I guess that's what I'm trying to get to, is anyone capable of evil?
Okay, so I think when you write a book about sexual violence in conflict and see how widespread it is, it does make you start to question, can anybody in a situation like this, why are people doing this? How can this possibly be enjoyable? Dragging women from burning huts in forests in Myanmar, tying them to banana trees and gang raping them in front of their screaming children. How is that in any way enjoyable? And actually, you have Antony Beevor coming here in a couple of weeks, who's written about what happened in Berlin when the Russian soldiers were there during the liberation, and the fact that they raped so many of the women. And I'm sure he'll talk to you about this. I talked to him, and he found himself very traumatized writing that book, because he started to think about himself. If he was in that situation, was there something latent that meant that he would do something like that? So, it's very hard to know. I spent a lot of time in places where wars are being carried out by dictators or evil people, and I'm not sure that you could drill back and say that they'd all been somehow traumatized in their youth. Some of them obviously were angry about certain things, but I think that's probably just to give an excuse to them.
Yeah. So I have to confess that I took your book, the one about sexual crimes in war, with me on holiday 2 weeks ago, and I was in the middle of the Atlantic on a boat thinking, I need to finish reading this book before the interview, and everything was peaceful. The sea was, sea wasn't peaceful, but the boat was very peaceful, and every time I took out the book and tried to read a little bit more, it was so terribly traumatizing and so very difficult to internalize as a concept when I was surrounded by beauty and nature, that I had to postpone it until I got on the Gatwick Express before I started reading it again. And I will say that I understand what Antony is saying. I do feel quite traumatized by the contents, and we can chat about that a bit more.
But I feel quite strongly that just because something is uncomfortable doesn't mean that we should ignore it. On the contrary, and we should try and understand why it's happening so much and do something about it. I mean, sexual violence in conflict is a war crime, and yet it's the most neglected war crime. Very few people are brought to justice. The International Criminal Court has brought 2 people to justice for it in 22 years. Hundreds of thousands of women and girls have been raped in wars, and men and boys in that time. It's something that people just didn't talk about or do anything about.
The 2 people who were brought to justice. Was that more recently? Has anything changed in the public perception? Yeah. So would you say that things are about to change in terms of what crimes are committed in war and how accountable people are? Or is it, because as I remember reading this in your book, and 22 years, 2 people, makes no sense at all in relation to the horror that we witnessed in your writing.
Well, I think one thing has changed, and that's Ukraine. I mean, so earlier this year, when the war started in Ukraine, I started getting messages from women, female activists in Ukraine, saying to me that the Russians are raping Ukrainian women. And to be honest, at the beginning, I didn't believe it. I was a bit like, really? I mean, now in 2022 in Europe, and also the war hadn't been going on for very long. And so I was a little bit skeptical, but then more and more reports started coming out. And then when Russia pulled its troops out of Bucha and Irpin, I went to those places and I talked to people, and I mean, most horrific stories, and there's no doubt that this happened on quite a large scale, and things have changed in that this got reported a lot. Now, previously, when I've tried to report on war rape in places like Democratic Republic of Congo or Myanmar or other places, I've literally had my foreign editor say to me, nobody wants to read about this. It was very, very hard to report on it. Suddenly, with Ukraine, everybody was reporting on this, very widespread, CNN, Sky, or, and I think that, I mean, it sounds weird to say that it's positive, because obviously it's horrific what happened, but it has made people suddenly much more aware of the issue, and people were doing something about it. The Ukrainian government is already carrying out trials. Zelensky, there are many things to admire about Zelensky. One of the things is that I think he's pretty much the first political leader I can think of who has talked about the rape in the same breath as the killings and tortures. He has daughters himself, and he has spoken about that as something that needs to be brought to justice. And lots of people are working on it. And as I said, they've already actually started trials while the war is going on. So that's really focused attention on the issue in a way that wasn't there. So I think hopefully that will lead to people looking at it in other places.
So this brings a question of conflict of interest. Is a country able to condemn and bring accountability to its perpetrators of war crimes, or does it need to be a higher order court that does this? I don't know what you think.
I mean, actually, in recent years, there have been some successes prosecuting sexual violence in conflict, and it's been in domestic courts, not in international courts. In fact, international courts, I think, have been sadly lacking. The first time that rape as a war crime was actually prosecuted at an international tribunal successfully, most people, when they think about it, will think Bosnia, because then, everybody at the time, the reporting of rape camps in Europe, and there was an international tribunal at The Hague, and so I think most people think that's where it was prosecuted for the first time, which is not the case, actually. The first successful prosecution was for Rwanda in the International Tribunal in Arusha in Tanzania. And actually, it's a very interesting story, because it was never set up to prosecute for sexual violence. The case was against a mayor of a small town called Taba, about an hour outside of Kigali. And this man, Jean-Paul Akayesu, was one of the first people captured, so he was tried. And he was being tried for torture and killing in his commune, the town hall in his town. And one of the women that came to testify, in her evidence, she said, and then we were raped. So there were 3 international judges, 2 men and a woman. And one of the men actually said, we're not interested in that, moving on. So fortunately, there was also a female judge called Navi Pillay, who is an amazing woman who'd been involved in the dismantling of the apartheid laws in South Africa. And she said, hang on a minute, this woman has come all the way here to testify. The very least we can do is listen to her story. So she asked about the rape, and the woman said, well, yeah, I mean, they were raping everybody. The town hall, lots of women were being raped. So then they actually ended up halting the trial and investigating this, discovering that indeed lots of women had been raped and girls. And in fact, I mean, the figures for Rwanda are nobody quite knows the estimates. 1 million people were killed in 100 days, 250,000 women raped. So they then reframed the whole trial to then include sexual violence as one of the charges, and he was convicted. So that was in 1998, and that was the first time.
Very interesting, and as you say, you know, the idea of the domestic court and that being able to happen. So was there an issue that was ideological or financial? Why were no big international courts addressing these issues? You mentioned Bosnia for a start. I mean, there would have been a lot of work for them if they had set something up then.
I mean, it's a good question. It's kind of why I wrote the book, because I was angry when I discovered how few prosecutions there were. I mean, I wrote this book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, really because I'd always really focused on women as a journalist in conflict, I suppose, being a woman. But I'd kind of been positive about it. I thought women are the heroes because they're the ones that are educating and feeding the children and protecting their elderly. And we don't have any statues for them, but they're the people doing all of this. But then I realized there's this dark side, which is the use of sexual violence and conflict against women in war. And there was a period about 8 years ago where I seemed to just be covering this all the time. And so you might remember in 2014, the Chibok girls in Nigeria who were abducted from their school dormitory in the middle of the night, about 250 girls. It became the biggest story on earth for about 2 weeks. And so lots of journalists from all over the world went to Abuja to try and find out what was going on. Not many people actually went to northeast Nigeria because it was very difficult to go there. And I ended up reporting a lot from there, spending quite a long time. And I discovered that these 250 girls were the tip of the iceberg, that actually tens of thousands of women and girls had been abducted by Boko Haram fighters, taken into the forest and forced to be what they called their bushwives. And so I was really horrified to hear the stories. Some of these girls were as young as 12. And what was also happening to them was that when they were rescued by Nigerian military, the Nigerian soldiers were often raping them again. And then when they were taken to the camps, their communities wouldn't take them back because they saw them as being sullied or brainwashed. And actually the only way that they could survive was to sleep with the camp officials to get food. So these girls were like victims over and over again. It was horrible. But that was sort of April, May 2014. And then you might remember that summer, ISIS fighters, Islamic State fighters, went into Shingal in northern Iraq and abducted thousands of Yazidi girls and took them into Syria to be their sex slaves. And so I went to report on that and interviewed lots of the girls who escaped, and they told horrendous stories about being taken to a place called the Galaxy Cinema in Mosul and divided into ugly and beautiful, and then the ISIS fighters would come and touch their hair, touch their breasts, and decide which girl that they wanted to take. And so I spoke to a lot of those girls, and some of the girls, I mean, the stories were just so horrific, but some of those girls told me that they were traded over and over again. I met one girl, Naima, who was traded 12 times between fighters, and she said she felt like a goat. And so that happened around the same time. And then a couple of years later, you might remember the Rohingya people who were all attacked by the Burmese military and also Buddhist militias in Burma, came into their villages, said that they weren't Burmese, that they were actually Bengali, and so set fire to their huts and dragged the women out and raped them. And around 600,000 people fled from Burma into Bangladesh within 3 months. And I went to interview a lot of those people. A majority were women, and one after another told stories of how they'd been raped. So we had all of these, you know, there was vast numbers of women and girls that this was happening to, and they were telling their stories. It wasn't as if nobody knew. But what was then happening, so I was, like other people, I was reporting on it, but then one of the ways my job has changed a lot is you stay in touch with people on WhatsApp. And people were WhatsApping me afterwards and saying, I told my story, what difference did it make? Yeah. And I couldn't answer the question, and I was really disturbed by this. So I was trying to understand, why is nobody, not a single person was prosecuted for what happened to the Yazidi. Nobody was prosecuted in Nigeria for what happened to the girls there. Nobody was prosecuted for what happened to the Rohingya. So overall, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of women. And I was profoundly disturbed by that. So I started researching more and more, and ended up, I didn't set out to write a book, but I ended up writing a book about it. So yeah, there really, to this day, accountability is the exception, not the rule, sadly.
So, well, first of all, let me just echo some of the things you said. It is the repetitive nightmare of what these women across the globe have been subjected to in different countries, absolutely very similar, systematically delivered sexual crimes that was, you know, so traumatizing. But what do you feel? And we'll go on to other topics, and we'll soon open it up to the audience. But so, what should happen next? Do you feel that, for example, one country should take the lead and try and show how things should be done, or should show enough interest to create? I mean, because it seems to me like nothing much is going on from what you're saying, and it seems impossible after reading what you've written.
I mean, justice doesn't happen by accident, and I think that it does need international leadership. I think that there's been a big problem, you asked me earlier, and I think that people have tended to not see rape as important as the killing and torture, which is why what Zelensky has said is so important. And I interviewed the Chief Justice of the trials in Nineveh in Iraq, where they have two courts trying the ISIS fighters, one in Baghdad, one in Nineveh. And the Chief Justice in Nineveh, I sat in the court, and it's not justice like we know it. It's kind of, people are coming within 20 minutes, the case is being decided and they're being given death sentences. But everybody was being tried for terrorism. So I asked the Chief Justice, so did any of these people have Yazidi sex slaves? And he said, yes, lots of them. So I said, why isn't that part of the charges? And he just literally laughed, and he said, why would we bother trying people for that? They also killed and tortured people. And so there's this profound lack of understanding of what it does to people. And I said to him, but to these women, what happened to them, most of the women told me they'd rather have died than go through this. So it's not something trivial. But he couldn't understand. So I think that there is a real issue of making people more aware of this. I think there's a problem generally that rape is a crime that's, even in this country, is pretty much decriminalized, right? Like less than 2% of rapes last year reported led to actual charges. So imagine in a place where you don't have access to lawyers and media and resources, it's really difficult. But I think that that doesn't mean we should just give up. And some people will say, oh, well, there's always been rape in war, which is true. I mean, I hardly find a conflict where it hasn't happened. But what we've seen in recent years is a very deliberate use of rape as a weapon of war, where people like against the Yazidis, the ISIS fighters were told it's your religious duty to capture these women and do this to them. The same against the Rohingya. For ethnic reasons, they were told that these people shouldn't be here and we need to wipe them out. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's about the capture of resources and people. There are some very lucrative minerals there, many of which we use in things every day, like our mobile phones and laptops, things like tantalus and also cobalt for electric cars. And so people want access to those things because they can make a lot of money, and the easiest way to drive people out of a village and get access is to rape the women and girls, and it terrorizes the population. And as one fighter said to me, it's the cheapest weapon known to man. And it's cheap because nobody's paying a price. Perpetrators are not being brought to justice. So I do think that it needs international leadership. There was actually a resolution passed at the United Nations more than 20 years ago, Resolution 1325, which said every member nation, including Russia, voted for it, which said we must do more about this, and also said we need more female participation in peacekeeping and in peace negotiations, because the two things are linked. And actually, unfortunately, in those 20 years, I would say that the situation has got worse.
Yeah.
So.
And actually, you bring me on to the peacekeeping side of things and how dangerous it is. I was reading recently about 250 peacekeepers dying in Mali and how the troops have pulled out. You know, is the world too dangerous now for foreign correspondents? Presumably, the minute the troops go, your colleagues are not going to go there on their own necessarily, or would they? You know, where are we at with the current situation globally? How dangerous is it now compared to maybe when you first started your career?
It did get more dangerous. I mean, when I first started, if anything happened to you as a journalist, it was bad luck, or you did something stupid, or I lost a lot of friends who were war correspondents in car accidents or plane crashes. We weren't targeted. That changed when really Islamic State, I mean, we became the front line because they could get more headlines by capturing and killing a journalist than they could by killing a soldier. So it became a lot more dangerous. And for a while, you know, I never imagined that I would say there were places too dangerous to go and report on, but that definitely was the case with Raqqa, for example. Under Islamic State, you would have been mad to go in as a Western journalist. You would have been captured and kidnapped and probably appeared in one of their videos with a knife at your throat. So, no, it became much more dangerous. Now, I mean, I'm not sure if there are places that I wouldn't go. I mean, obviously this year Ukraine has been very much the story. We never imagined that we'd have a war in Europe again, and we have all been going and reporting. In fact, in a strange way, it's been a war that has been easier to report because much of my reporting in recent years has been in the Middle East, in places where they don't really want us. In Ukraine, they really want Western journalists because they need weapons from our countries, so they want us to be reporting, and so everybody wants to speak to you and help you, and it's actually quite a rewarding place in a way. You feel like you're doing something worthwhile, which you don't always feel.
So before we move on to questions, we've talked about violence perpetrated by men on men and on women. But have you come across any very violent women?
Yes, of course. I mean, in Rwanda, there was this woman, Pauline, who was one of the people who was sort of really behind a lot of the terrible things that happened during the genocide, and encouraging the young male fighters to go and rape women. So it isn't all men behind it. And as I said earlier, it's not all women that it happens to. It's also happening to men, particularly in detention centres. So in Syria, Assad's prisons, a lot of men have been sexually tortured. I interviewed a couple of years ago, there's a movie called The Mauritanian, which is very good, which is about a guy who was in Guantanamo, obviously from Mauritania, and he was the most tortured prisoner in Guantanamo, waterboarding, everything, even though actually they never framed any charges against him, and in the end he was released. And I interviewed him when this film was coming out, and he said to me, the worst thing that happened to me was the sexual violence. Now, I had no idea that he'd undergone anything like that. I hadn't read anything about that. So I said, well, what do you mean? And he said that the American guards had raped him, basically, female guards. And he said to me, I just can't, it's the hardest thing to deal with. I felt like an object. I can't deal with intimacy now. It's destroyed my ability to have a relationship. And so that was American women.
Wow. American army women.
Yeah. So we mustn't think, I think sometimes people think, oh, this is something that happens far away and, in conflicts in other places, but it's not.
Right. I think, I don't know if we've got the roving mic somewhere. Hopefully we do. But I would very much like, and I'm going to literally go through. So, thank you. Could I have a volunteer? Thank you. Would you like to ask the first question? And then if you have a question.
I'll do the roving.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm a great rover. Thank you very much for being here. It's fantastic. I've been very concerned or intrigued with the Ukrainian conflict and the issue of propaganda coming from both sides, because these days we have so much more access to information, which is good, and tried to keep aware and on top of the, even in just war, propaganda for Ukraine. How do you cope with that as a journalist? Have you had any experience of how you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the very first conflict I ever covered was back in the late 80s, was when the Russians were in Afghanistan. And I was very young. I was 21 when I went there. And from outside, that was reported in a way that made it look very black and white, as if it was basically the Afghan mujaheddin were like, it was like a David and Goliath thing, that they were these sort of fighters from the mountains with old Lee Enfield rifles and plastic sandals, ranged against the most powerful army on earth. So it looked very straightforward. And then when I got there, it wasn't like that at all. It was really shades of grey, right? And actually, yes, they were men from the mountains, but they had very sophisticated weapons, which had been given by the US and Europe, Stinger missiles and other things. They were doing some really bad things. They were capturing Russians and torturing them and playing buzkashi, this polo that they play with goats, but using heads of prisoners. And so I was really shocked because I, from outside, had thought this was, very easy to report on. And then when I got there, I thought, well, actually, this isn't like I thought. So it was a very good lesson very early on that things are not as straightforward. Yeah. And I've never forgotten that. I never make prejudgments before I go somewhere about what I'm going to be reporting on. I go there and see how the situation is. I am slightly concerned about our reporting on Ukraine because it is very one-sided, right? We're only covering it from one side because we don't have access to the other side. So, and it's easy to think, well, Putin is doing, he started this war, the Ukrainians didn't ask for it, and they're doing all these terrible things, and we are going and seeing the atrocities. There's no doubt that they are. But I don't think that necessarily means that the Ukrainians are all good, right? We saw an example of this a bit last night when everyone, the Telegraph this morning reports that Russia fires missiles into Poland. In fact, they were Ukrainian, they weren't. So you can't just rush to judgment like that. But, you can also say those missiles wouldn't have been fired if Russia hadn't been firing lots of missiles into Ukraine. So, it does feel like there's definitely one side that is in the wrong, if you like. But I feel strongly that we shouldn't therefore think everything the Ukrainians do is right and everything that the Russians do is wrong. And, frankly, there were a lot of bad things happening in Ukraine before this war started. So we have to be careful.
Thank you, Christina. Now, I'm going to go down this line first. Anyone? You? Yes?
Hi, fascinating talk. I'm just intrigued. Just go back a step, because I think stories are so important, and your job as a foreign correspondent is incredibly important. So I'm just wondering how you got into that, and actually how journalism has evolved. And it seems that so much stuff is just opinion pieces, but actually not someone that's done a proper, gone out to the place and take the story. I'm just wondering where there have been tensions that you've had, where a story you wanted to report and the editors just said, no one's interested in that. It must be almost a journalistic ethical challenge, as it were.
Yeah. So I've never been asked to write anything that I didn't agree with, right? I wouldn't do it. But I, of course, have had times where I've wanted to report things and they've said no. Fortunately, foreign reporting is very expensive, and foreign reporting has been cut back a lot. So I work for the Sunday Times. We used to have 10 pages of foreign news. Now we have 2 or 3. We have far fewer correspondents, so lots of things are not getting covered. How much coverage did you read about the war in Ethiopia, which was, so many people were killed and raped? There was very little coverage of it. I have personal passions. I'm obsessed by Afghanistan because it was where I started out, and I've gone back and forth for more than 30 years. So I fight very strongly to keep covering Afghanistan, and I have. My paper has supported me to do that, and I've gone back several times since the Taliban took over. I think, unfortunately, it's becoming harder for us to actually go there because the Taliban have, whereas at the beginning we couldn't really believe how easy it was to report under them, they've now started to feel that they've lost control of foreign correspondence, and therefore, so now we have to have permission before. Yeah. I mean, it was a weird situation where the embassies of the Afghan government, which collapsed, all still operating around the world. So the Afghan embassy here in London is the embassy for a government that doesn't exist. Wow. But it's still, so we were getting visas from that government, from their embassy, and then travelling to Afghanistan under the Taliban with those visas, which was good for us, but I think that's not going to continue. So I started out, you asked how I started. I always wanted to write. It's quite a long story how I started out, but basically I got invited to a wedding, and that wedding was in Pakistan. What had happened was when I left university, I interned at the Financial Times, And one day the foreign editor was supposed to go to a lunch of South Asian politicians, and last minute he couldn't go. And I travelled quite a lot in India when I was a student, and I was obsessed by it. So he said to me, "You're always going on about India, so why don't you go to this lunch?" So I went to this lunch and sat next to somebody who was the Secretary General of the Pakistan People's Party, which was the opposition party in Pakistan. At that time, Pakistan was a military dictatorship under General Zia. And this Secretary General of the party said to me, "Would you like to interview our leader, who's in exile in London?" That leader was Benazir Bhutto. So of course I said yes. So I went to interview her, and the day I went to interview her, her flat was absolutely full of the most amazing bouquets of flowers. And she had just announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. So I wrote my piece. It was my first interview with somebody important, and so I was very excited. She was happy because she couldn't be written about in the Pakistani media because of censorship. So she was really dependent on foreign coverage. And then I got a job at Central TV in Birmingham as a trainee. And one day I came home from work, and on my doorstep was the most beautiful gold-inscribed invitation, which was to Benazir's wedding in Karachi. So I had never been to Pakistan, and it was the most amazing introduction to Pakistan. Excuse me. If you've ever been to a South Asian wedding, you'll note that they're very colourful, go on for a very long time. And her wedding, being Benazir, was really like something out of the Arabian Nights. So I went to this wedding, and every night after all the ceremonial events, there would be discussions in her house with her political colleagues about how to try and topple the military dictator General Zia. And I was fascinated. I'd never met anybody. These people were all telling me about being tortured and tear gassed and arrested to try and bring democracy to their country. I'd never met anybody who'd been through any of these things. So I couldn't really imagine going back to Birmingham and covering local news. So when I came back and gave him my notice, the last story I ever did for Central News was a man who turned his car back to front, so it looked like it was going forwards when he was going backwards. I don't think it was a great loss to TV. And then I went to Pakistan. But when I spoke to foreign editors about covering Pakistan, nobody was interested. They all said, General Zia has been there for 11 and a half years, nothing's going to change. But they were interested in Afghanistan. So they said to me, "Why don't you go and cover Afghanistan?" So I went to live in Peshawar on the border with Afghanistan and started traveling back and forth with the mujaheddin and fell in love with it. So I didn't set out to cover war, and actually I hate war. I wish all wars would end. They don't achieve anything in my view, and lots of people get killed.
Well, thank you for that very concise but really important bit that brings us up to now. There's a question behind, yes, and if anyone else in the first 3 rows here would like to ask questions, you just show your hand. That would be great.
Can I ask, have you interviewed any of the men who have been the perpetrators of rape? Have you asked them how they have justified their actions?
That's a very good question. So obviously you can't really write a book like that without thinking about that question and what motivates people. And I found very little written about it, actually. I thought there would be a lot of academic research on it. So my book was about women, what war does to women. So I actually think that what motivates perpetrators is a different book in a way. But I did try and speak to some. I went to a prison in northern Iraq that had lots of Islamic State fighters that I knew had taken Yazidi slaves. I met a group of men who I knew had had slaves, and they all said, "Oh, no, we didn't, it was my cousin," or "I don't think this is a good thing." And maybe, I mean, in a way, I don't think a man could have written my book, because it would have been very hard for the women to have told those kind of stories to a man. I think in a way, it's not very easy as a woman to talk to perpetrators, particularly from when it's like Islamic State. I think they would have found it easier to have talked to a man about it. So I hope somebody else does some research on this, because it is really important to know. But I didn't find much, I have to say.
Thank you, Christina. Your last chance over there. Great. And anyone else who wants the next question from this side before I move along? Okay.
Hi. This might be a bit of an unfair question, really, but with your interest in Pakistan, where you started, and that, what is your thoughts and opinions about Imran Khan and the Pakistan politics at the moment?
Okay. So I have interviewed Imran Khan many times, because when I lived in Pakistan, it drove me mad that, so that was in the late 80s, but I've gone back and forth. And there was always this obsession here with Imran Khan because of his cricket career. And so I was always getting editors asking me to interview him, and when he went into politics. And I kept pointing out to them that he only had one seat, just his own seat. He wasn't like an influential politician, but they wanted to know his views on everything. So I have interviewed him many times. I've seen the way he's changed from the days when he was a playboy in London to then being an Islamist who denies that he ever did any of those things. I think he's a complete hypocrite, because I know what he did in the past. But I also think that he did a good thing in Pakistan. He raised a huge amount of money to build the best cancer hospital in Pakistan. And then when he went into politics, he really motivated a lot of young people in Pakistan who were not interested in politics, because politics in Pakistan, sadly, for so long has been really a dynastic thing, that you've had these two families, the Bhuttos on one side, and then the Sharifs, Nawaz Sharif and his brother Shahbaz, who is now Prime Minister, on the other side, and it's switching back and forth, both of them having been Prime Minister 3 times, and then whoever gets in power imprisons the other, and, you know, I mean, it's a sad comment on Pakistan. I've been going there since '87. I still know most of the people in politics there, because the people don't change. And I cannot think of another country that I go to where 35 years on, it's still the same people. And, you know, it is because it is this dynastic thing. So the good thing Imran Khan did was try and change that. However, when he became Prime Minister, I think he was a disaster. I mean, the economy was completely mishandled. He peddled all these conspiracy theories about what the United States was doing in Pakistan. He was completely, I mean, he was far more repressive in terms of media freedom than the dictators had been. So Pakistan became one of the worst places on earth to be a journalist under him. Lots of journalists were arrested. My friends there working in TV, there was a button that would be pressed if people started saying things that were considered to be detrimental of Imran Khan, and then they would be taken off air. There was no coverage of opposition when he was Prime Minister. So I don't think that, unfortunately, he was a good example. Now, when there was this no confidence vote to topple him, he tried to get the military to intervene, to have martial law rather than be removed, which is also not a good thing to have done. And now he has been leading this movement, and he does bring out people, because he, you know, is basically, apart from Malala, who is very controversial, sadly, in Pakistan. He is Pakistan's most famous person, so people will come out on the streets. He's been leading these big gatherings in Pakistan since he was toppled to try and now topple the government that's there. And as I'm sure you know, got shot recently.
Thank you, Christina. I'm going to just give a chance to people on this side of the room. And there's I can see 2 rows of highly politicized individuals there who I know I'm trying to ask questions. So let's keep the answers as brief as we can to give everyone an opportunity. I think first you, then Joe, did you put up your hand? Then Anna, then Fiona. Okay.
Well, I mean, I'm glad I came. I always read you. I think you always know I'm going to get a damn good piece out of you and really get an idea of what's going on. I haven't read your books yet, but I remember that. I can remember things from way back when I was a teenager, of things I saw on television or things I read about. I'm trying to read something called The Choice from the woman who was in the Holocaust. I don't know if you remember her.
Yes.
I find it so difficult to read, and yet I make myself because I know that's the only way you can learn and do more. But how do you... I suppose I'm really asking you, for me, a personal question. I find it very hard to get these images, the images of this man you told me about, you know, to get them out of my mind. Have you got any sort of secret thing? Would you only have a large gin and tonic? Do you think I won't do one for a couple of weeks? How do you cope with such huge, huge memories? And just to say again, congratulations. I think you're a terrific journalist.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Well, it's a really good question. And I found particularly this book on war rate really hard to write. I couldn't work on it for very long. I'm sorry it's hard to read, but it is. I mean, these women were so brave in telling their stories, and I think what motivated me was, you know, however hard it was for me to write, it was way harder for them to tell and to go through those things. So I feel very strongly that, maybe naively, but you know, you hope that by writing about these things that things will change. And actually the hardest thing for me is not seeing all these atrocities and writing about them. It's when nothing happens and when I get those messages like, what difference does it make? I find that really, really difficult. But yeah, I mean, I don't really hang out with other war correspondents when I come back. I don't go to the bar and drink with and tell war stories. I have a family, I'm a mother, and my son, as you just met, is now grown up and a student. But when he was younger, of course, when I came back from places I'd been away, I would immediately come back and be mum and be taking him to football practice and things. And so I think in a way that was quite grounding. I also, you know, go for walks and try and remember that there are beautiful things in life. And I read a lot of novels, I go to the theatre, go and look at trees in Richmond Park. And just things like that, and being with friends, really.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Joe's question. Is it you, Joe, who wanted to ask? Yeah.
Thank you. It's really fascinating to hear your stories. I was thinking about the women at the moment of Iran who are making a stand for themselves. And when one is treated badly, they are standing up for each other. And I just would be interested, I don't know how it's going to unfold or what's going to happen, as none of us do, but it's for me inspiring and worrying, and I'm very far away from it, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that current situation.
Yeah. So, I mean, Iran, I'm lucky enough to have gone there a few times to report, is a fascinating place. Absolutely beautiful, and people so interesting. It's funny because it's a place where I was so surprised the first time I went, because I had this image of, you know, the government being, the regime being so anti-West, and then you go there and the people are so friendly. Everybody you meet is asking you, come and have tea or coffee, and everybody seemed to want to know about the West and the outside. Like everybody probably here, I've been in awe of those women and men coming out on the streets. I fear it will end badly, but I'm amazed how long it's gone on for now. I mean, at the beginning, I remember like the Green Revolution and then the protests in 2019, which were much bigger in a way in Tehran, but they weren't across the country like this. So I think this has made it much harder for the regime to deal with. And those protests were, you know, they quite quickly cracked down with the Republican Guards and the Basiji, and a lot of people were killed and arrested, and then that was it. This time they didn't crack down so much at the beginning. Now I think it's quite hard because it's gone all over the country, and there are some indications from some of the statements that, you know, there are some differences within the regime of what to do about this. These women are phenomenally brave. It's very frustrating for us not to be able to report. I've had a request in for a visa for like 2 months. Oddly enough, they're not giving visas to foreign journalists. They don't want people there. And so I don't know what's going to happen. You know, I was really worried that this would just end badly. Now you know, it's going on and on. Who knows? Maybe this is the first revolution of women. And it's interesting for my women in Afghanistan because, you know, the only protests against the Taliban have sadly been women there. No men have come out like in Iran. And they've been very small, but you know, they're watching to see what's happening, and it's giving them some kind of encouragement too.
Thank you. We've got 2 questions in the back row, and then I'll move forward in the last 5 minutes before we finish. Keep it all brief, questions and answers.
Hello,
Okay.
My name is Anna. My question is mainly focused towards kind of propaganda and pursuit of genuine truth. I mean, when you refer to Afghanistan and that conflict between Afghanistan and Russia in the 80s, it's very easy as a Westerner to view that on BBC News or whatever after your day of work and think, okay, that's my information I've gathered from that. I feel relatively informed. I can move forward as a knowledgeable person. A question leading to that really would be, is it more dangerous to know half the truth than the whole truth? And also, as a student, a young person trying to gather some sort of sense of realism and grasp what is going on. I mean, I want to know the truth, not what is presented to me initially. What tools could I genuinely take forward in pursuing that instead of... I make an effort, I try and gather both. My dad is Serbian. I'm aware that he presents an angle that is completely separate to my social circles, however diverse they are. What are tools that I can move forward with to try and gather a more representational and real view of the world?
Thank you.
That's very interesting. I mean, I think this is a huge challenge for all of us because obviously there's such a massive information coming in from all different sources, and how do you know it's true? I mean, the last question about Iran, this is a problem for us. There's lots of stuff out there on social media from pictures of things happening in Iran, but how do we know that all of this is genuine? When you follow a country for a while, you tend to have some sources on social media that are reliable, and so that these things are likely to be true, but other things you don't. And you have to make assumptions sometimes that if there's a lot of stuff coming from the same village and different pictures from different people, then it's likely that it is some basis to it. But I think there's no substitute for actually being in the place, and so that, I mean, I would say that because I work for it, but I think that traditional, or what some people call mainstream media, has a value because you can trust that we are genuinely going to those places and reporting from them, and we're not. If I go, I feel quite strongly about this. If I'm reporting a war, and I'm in a particular place, I only know what's happening in that place. I don't know what's happening in the rest of the country. I can't make statements about what's happening elsewhere. I can give you a very in-depth report about the particular place, but I can't know beyond that. In fact, during the war in Iraq, I was covering Basra and that area. I knew very well what was happening around there. But when I came back, so that was kind of before really having internet and mobile phones, and when I came back, I felt like I'd missed the war, because everyone back home were talking about different things that happened that they saw on TV, and I'd been there in Iraq all the time, but I'd never seen any of those things because I was in a different place. So I think that, you have to just try and build credible sources. You follow people that you see over time that what they're saying is correct, because it keeps coming. You can check what happens and ask questions about, are those people that are putting stuff on Facebook or TikTok or different medias, have they got some particular point of view, and be quite discerning about what you're taking in. But it is difficult because there is just so much stuff out there.
Fiona, were you asking? Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to come back to rape again and ask if you could talk a little bit about the impact that collective rape has on the community, and how they then recover. How do the families recover? How do the communities recover? How do the marriages, the relationships between the men and women of the community recover?
Well, I think the absolute most upsetting thing about covering this is that, and I sort of referred to this with the Nigerian girls, that rape is the one crime where the victim is made to feel that they've done something wrong. So often their own communities won't take them back. That's incredibly upsetting. Or they cannot talk about what happened to them. We've seen this with what happened to the German women at the end of World War II. Very few spoke about it. There were a lot of suicides afterwards, and I found my book has come out in a lot of countries in Europe. I've spoken in Poland and Hungary and different places, and always when I've spoken, people have come to me at the end and said, this happened to my aunt, or this happened to my grandmother, and nobody spoke about it. It was like the secret in the family. It was and so these women had to live for years with nobody speaking about it, or being made to feel they'd done something wrong. Some of the women that I met, like women in Bangladesh who were raped by Pakistani soldiers in the war in 1970-71, they had to meet me in secret. They meet still in secret because they can't talk about what happened to them. I think probably maybe the most moving of all the women I met was these women in the Philippines who were great-grandmothers in their late 80s who were taken by the Japanese soldiers during World War II, kept as comfort women, taken when they were not even puberty, some of those girls. And they could never speak about what happened. And only in the last 10, 15 years, after one woman came out and spoke on radio, Rosa, and then the others were astonished, and then they started to speak. I mean, those women, I talked about the need for justice earlier, but I think justice means different things to different people. It doesn't necessarily mean actually seeing your perpetrator in court. It can mean just acknowledgement of what happened and that you did nothing wrong, that wrong was done to you. And so in some countries like the Philippines, it's not even in their history books what happened to them. And when they raised money to build a statue on Manila Bay for comfort women in memory of them, it was taken down by their government. So it's complete denial. I mean, in Japan today, there is still denial of what happened, even though this was a systematic, massive scheme, about 200,000 women, it was documented. And so I think, actually the problem is more, it isn't that what it's doing to the communities, it is that the communities don't often support the women. And my book, although it's got difficult things, it's also got some great heroes. One of my personal heroes is a man called Dr. Mukwege, who you may or may not have heard of, who's a gynecologist who set up a hospital in Eastern Congo called the Panzi Hospital in 1999. He set it up because he was worried about maternal mortality rates. He'd studied in France and seen the huge difference there. And then the first women that came to him had all been raped, terribly raped, like their vaginas had been set fire to, horrendous things. And he was shocked. He was like, and thought this must be some one-off thing. And then this kept happening over and over again. His hospital has treated 55,000 women and girls who have been raped. I think nobody on earth probably knows more about it than he. And he realized quite quickly that he could repair the physical damage as a doctor and surgeon, but that actually wasn't enough, that these women were all very traumatized. So then he started bringing in lots of psychologists to treat the women. And then he realized that actually that wasn't enough, because these women had nowhere to go. Their communities wouldn't take them back, and so they had no way of making a living. So he then started at his hospital a program training women, teaching them to read and write, giving them loans to set up small businesses, helping them with leadership, and so that they actually had a way of making a living when they left. And now, the most recent bit of his hospital, he now has a legal department for women that actually want to try and take their perpetrators to court. And so this man is amazing, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize, actually rightly, in 2018 with Nadia Murad, the Yazidi sex slave who speaks out a lot. But I mean, Dr. Mukwege says he lives in the hospital grounds. He gets constant death threats, so he lives almost in prison there in his hospital. And he feels very frustrated. I really recommend you to Google his speech that he made when he got the Nobel Peace Prize. It was so passionate, so amazing. But he said to me, everybody applauded me and then nothing changed. And he said, I didn't do this work to get applause and a prize. I wanted to change things, and nothing has changed.
Thank you, Christina. Now, my apologies to the rest of the room, but I have gone 15 minutes over time, and I promised everyone in the room that they would have time to get the book signed. I know lots of you want to buy copies, and can I just say, I cannot imagine living this year without having read your book. It was transforming in every way. And I think about it every day, and I think with the RSM, what can we do in the future to take this further somehow, the mission that you're on? So I would suggest that instead we move to have a drink outside of the ENT room. We buy your books, you sign them, we continue chatting, and then at 8 o'clock, whoever's staying for dinner can stay. But I just want to say on behalf of the Royal Society of Medicine, it has been one of the most memorable nights, and we are very, very grateful to you. So please join me in thanking Christina.